They say the smallest mistake can change the fate of the most powerful man in the city, but no one imagined that mistake would come from the clumsiest waitress in Manhattan. Rachel Brooks had always believed her life would be remembered for the wrong reasons. At 24 years old, she had perfected the awkward art of apologizing before anyone even complained. She apologized when she bumped into chairs, when she laughed too loudly, when she reached for a glass and somehow managed to knock over two more beside it. The staff at Belladonna's Italian restaurant joked that gravity had a personal grudge against her. Some called her walking disaster. Others simply smiled because Rachel never became angry. She would laugh at herself first, brush a strand of curly blonde hair behind her ear, adjust the little apron that never seemed to stay straight around her waist, and whisper, "I'm so sorry," with a smile so genuine that even irritated customers often found themselves smiling back. Tonight was different. Friday evenings always carried a strange electricity inside Belladonna's. Crystal chandeliers reflected warm amber light across polished marble floors, while a jazz trio played softly near the wine cellar. Every table was reserved. Every employee had been warned that one very important guest would arrive before sunset. Rachel repeated the manager's instructions inside her head as she balanced two sizzling steaks and a basket of garlic bread on her tray. Don't stare. Don't speak unless spoken to. Don't make mistakes around table 7. She nodded to herself, determined to survive one shift without embarrassing herself. Then she turned too quickly, clipped the corner of a decorative plant, nearly lost the tray, caught it with an awkward spin that somehow saved dinner, but sent a folded receipt floating through the air like a lonely paper bird. Seriously, she muttered under her breath, chasing after it with cheeks already burning. She bent down to grab the paper, just as polished black shoes stopped inches from her trembling fingers. Slowly her eyes lifted. Tailored charcoal suit. Powerful shoulders. Tattoos disappearing beneath a crisp white collar. Calm gray eyes that seemed capable of noticing everything without revealing a single thought. Ethan Knight had entered the restaurant without announcing himself, yet silence spread through the room as naturally as candlelight. Conversations softened. Glasses paused halfway to lips. Even the musicians missed a note before recovering. Rachel had heard rumors about the mysterious businessman whose name appeared on magazine covers and whispered conversations alike, but standing this close made every rumor feel strangely incomplete. He looked less like a monster and more like a man carrying invisible weight no one else could see. Mortified, Rachel reached for the receipt, only realizing too late that it wasn't a receipt anymore. During her frantic scramble, she had accidentally picked up a folded note from beneath the nearby table, one that wasn't written in restaurant handwriting at all. Before her brain caught up with her hands, she smiled nervously and tucked the paper beneath Ethan's steak plate while mumbling, "Your dinner, sir." He gave a polite nod, completely unaware that the tiny folded note resting inches from his hand contained 8 words that would quietly unravel every certainty he had ever trusted. "Your girlfriend sold you out." They're in position. 4 hours earlier, Belladonna's had smelled of fresh basil, roasted garlic, and warm bread long before the first customer walked through the polished oak doors. Rachel Brooks hurried across the dining room with a stack of neatly folded napkins pressed against her chest, trying to remember every instruction her manager had repeated that afternoon. Tonight had to be perfect. She whispered those words to herself like a lucky charm, although experience had taught her that the harder she tried not to make mistakes, the more creative those mistakes became. She reached the corner table, caught the edge of her apron on a chair, spun halfway around, and watched dozens of white napkins float into the air like oversized snowflakes. A few coworkers sighed while others laughed softly. Marco, the head server, pinched the bridge of his nose before helping gather them from the spotless floor. "Rachel," he said with a tired smile, "one day you are going to invent a completely new way to surprise us." She laughed so hard that she accidentally bumped his shoulder. "See? I am already practicing." Even Marco could not stop himself from chuckling. Nobody disliked Rachel. She worked harder than anyone else, volunteered for extra shifts without complaint, remembered regular customers by name, and somehow found reasons to compliment strangers who barely noticed her. She carried an innocence that felt almost impossible inside Manhattan, as if disappointment had never convinced her to become cynical. During her short break, she slipped into the kitchen, carefully dividing her blueberry muffin into 3 uneven pieces. One went to Luis, the dishwasher working his second job. Another disappeared into the hands of a nervous teenage busboy celebrating his first paycheck. Rachel kept the smallest piece for herself without thinking twice. "You always give away your food," the pastry chef teased. She shrugged with an embarrassed grin. "It tastes better when people smile." Nobody argued with that. By 5 o'clock, the restaurant transformed completely. Fresh flowers arrived. Candles were lit one by one. Expensive wine bottles were arranged with military precision. Managers inspected every polished glass until they reflected light without a single fingerprint. Rachel stood before the employee mirror attempting to smooth her uniform for the third time. Her curly blonde hair refused to cooperate, springing loose around her cheeks no matter how carefully she tucked it behind her ears. She stared at her reflection and quietly practiced introducing herself to important guests before shaking her head. "Too formal," she whispered. "Too cheerful. Just be normal." Unfortunately, being normal had never been one of Rachel's talents. A few minutes later, she attempted to carry 6 sparkling water glasses across the dining room. Everything went perfectly until a little girl waved excitedly from a nearby booth. Rachel smiled back, forgot to watch where she was walking, and gently bumped into a decorative stand holding fresh roses. The flowers tipped sideways, the glasses rattled dangerously, and every employee froze. Somehow she caught the tray before anything shattered, but one bright red rose landed squarely on top of her head. The little girl burst into uncontrollable laughter. Rachel carefully removed the flower, gave it an exaggerated royal bow, and presented it to the delighted child, earning applause from several nearby diners. Even the manager who had been ready to scold her found himself hiding a reluctant smile. Across the room, unnoticed by everyone, 2 sharply dressed men quietly entered through a private side entrance. They did not order drinks. They did not study the menu. Instead, they selected a secluded booth with a perfect view of the front entrance, exchanged a brief glance, and lowered their voices until only fragments drifted across the room. Rachel, balancing another tray while humming softly to herself, walked past at exactly the wrong moment, completely unaware that a single overheard sentence would soon force her ordinary heart into an extraordinary decision. Rachel barely noticed the 2 men after passing their booth because another familiar disaster immediately demanded her attention. A customer at table 4 accidentally dropped a fork beneath the chair, and eager to help, she hurried over before anyone else could move. She knelt to retrieve it, stood too quickly, and bumped the corner of the table just enough to make a glass wobble dramatically. Time seemed to stop. Her eyes widened. The family gasped. Somehow she caught the falling glass with one hand before it reached the floor, but the unexpected movement sent a dinner roll flying through the air. It landed perfectly inside the open bread basket at the neighboring table. The little boy sitting there burst into applause while his parents laughed so hard they forgot to be annoyed. Rachel covered her face for a second before laughing at herself. "I promise I did not practice that," she said, earning another round of smiles. As she hurried back toward the kitchen, she passed the secluded booth once again. One sentence floated through the soft jazz music. "Everything begins when he sits down." She frowned for only a moment before shaking her head. It sounded like someone discussing a surprise proposal or perhaps an important business presentation. Manhattan was full of dramatic conversations. It was none of her business. Inside the kitchen, the pace became even faster. Orders arrived nonstop. Plates disappeared almost as quickly as chefs finished preparing them. Marco scanned the dining room before calling Rachel's name. "You are on table 7 tonight." She blinked. "Me?" "Yes." The regular server called in sick. "Just remember the rules. Be polite. Stay calm. Do not ask questions." Rachel nodded so enthusiastically that her ponytail bounced against her shoulders. "I can absolutely stay calm." At that exact moment, she reached for a tray and accidentally picked up an empty one instead of the prepared order, making 2 cooks exchange amused glances. Marco simply sighed toward the ceiling. "That is exactly what worries me." Rachel stuck out her tongue playfully after he turned away, making the pastry chef laugh again. Minutes later, she carefully reviewed the reservation card. Table 7. For guests. Special wine pairing. Private service only. She repeated every detail inside her head while arranging silverware with unusual concentration. Across the dining room, the front entrance quietly opened. The atmosphere shifted before anyone even looked toward the door. Experienced employees instinctively straightened their posture. Conversations softened without anyone requesting silence. Rachel sensed the change and curiously peeked over another server's shoulder. Ethan Knight entered beside an elegant brunette whose confidence filled the room almost as naturally as his calm presence. She wore a tailored ivory dress and greeted the restaurant manager with effortless familiarity. Rachel assumed she must be his girlfriend. They certainly looked like the sort of successful couple who belonged on magazine covers. Ethan acknowledged the welcoming staff with a brief nod before escorting his companion toward the reserved table. Rachel found herself staring a second too long. "Focus," she whispered to herself. Unfortunately, she turned while still looking in their direction and walked directly into one of the decorative wooden columns standing between the dining room and the wine display. The gentle thump echoed louder than it should have. She stumbled backward, rubbing her forehead with both hands as embarrassment flooded her cheeks. Several nearby diners smiled kindly. Even Ethan's lips curved almost imperceptibly before he continued walking. Rachel pretended nothing had happened, inhaled deeply, collected the menu folders with trembling fingers, and started toward table 7, completely unaware that the strange conversation she had ignored only minutes earlier and the seemingly perfect couple now seated before her were already connected by a secret waiting to reveal itself. Rachel balanced a polished silver tray with both hands as she approached table 7, silently repeating every instruction Marco had drilled into her since the beginning of the shift. "Smile naturally. Speak clearly. Do not interrupt." She reached the table without tripping, which already felt like a personal victory, and carefully placed crystal water glasses before each guest. Ethan thanked her with a quiet nod while the elegant brunette beside him never looked up from her conversation. Rachel noticed the woman's flawless appearance, the expensive watch that caught the candlelight, and the effortless confidence with which she occupied the room. Across from them sat another well-dressed couple discussing vacation homes, charity events, and business investments that sounded like another universe to someone whose biggest concern was making rent before the end of the month. Rachel finished pouring sparkling water and stepped back exactly as she had practiced. Then she turned too quickly and lightly bumped her elbow against the wine cart. The bottle tilted. Her heart nearly stopped. She caught it just before it slipped, hugging it awkwardly against her chest. A nervous laugh escaped before she could stop it. "I am really sorry," she whispered. The bottle wanted to explore the restaurant. For the first time that evening, Ethan looked directly at her. His expression remained calm, but there was the faintest hint of amusement in his eyes. His companion, however, barely concealed her annoyance. "Perhaps someone more experienced should be serving tonight," she remarked coolly without raising her voice. Rachel felt heat rush into her face. "I understand, ma'am. I promise I will be more careful." She walked away determined not to make another mistake, but embarrassment lingered with every step. While waiting beside the service station for the entrees, she noticed one of the two mysterious men from the secluded booth excuse himself and disappear toward the hallway leading to the private dining rooms. A minute later, the second man quietly answered a phone call. His voice remained low, yet one sentence drifted clearly through the soft music. "Everyone is in position." Rachel looked around instinctively. In position for what? She frowned before convincing herself it probably referred to photographers, musicians, or staff preparing some elaborate engagement surprise. Wealthy people planned extravagant evenings all the time. Still, something about the man's serious tone refused to leave her thoughts. Moments later, another server accidentally picked up the wrong order, leaving Rachel carrying a tray intended for the secluded booth instead of table 7. She apologized, exchanged plates, and hurried toward the correct destination. But as she passed behind the two men again, she heard another fragment. She confirmed he trusts her completely. Rachel slowed for half a second. She assumed they must be discussing someone's anniversary or a surprise gift. Yet neither man smiled. Their faces remained strangely emotionless. Before she could think further, Marco called her name from across the room, reminding her that table 7 had been waiting. She quickly delivered the entrees, carefully placing Ethan's steak before him and the grilled salmon before his companion. As she reached to straighten a folded napkin that had slipped near the edge of the table, she noticed a tiny black envelope resting beneath an empty chair, almost invisible against the dark carpet. Believing another guest had dropped a reservation card, Rachel quietly picked it up, intending to hand it to the manager after finishing her service. She had no idea that the simple act of bending down for what looked like forgotten stationery had placed the first real piece of an invisible puzzle into her unsuspecting hands. Rachel waited until she reached the quiet service station before looking at the small black envelope she had picked up beneath the table. It felt unusually heavy for its size, as though someone had slipped a thick business card inside. She glanced toward the dining room. Every guest remained absorbed in conversation. Believing it belonged to one of the wealthy customers, she carefully opened the flap, hoping to identify the owner before returning it. Instead of a business card, she found a folded seating diagram of the restaurant. Tiny red circles marked several tables, including the one where Ethan and his guests were dining. Rachel blinked in confusion. Why would someone map out dinner tables? She turned the paper over and noticed a short handwritten note in neat block letters. Wait for the signal. Do not move early. She frowned, trying to make sense of it. Perhaps it was part of a surprise celebration organized by an event planner. Belladonna's occasionally hosted elaborate proposals and anniversary parties. Yet something about the careful markings made her uneasy. Before she could study it further, Marco called for her to refill water glasses in the private dining section. Rachel quickly folded the paper and slipped it into her apron pocket, deciding she would hand everything to the manager after the dinner rush. As she crossed the hallway leading toward the private rooms, she heard quiet footsteps approaching from the opposite direction. Instinctively, she stepped behind a decorative archway to avoid colliding with another employee. Two unfamiliar men stopped only a few feet away. Their expensive suits matched the polished appearance of businessmen, but their conversation carried none of the warmth she had heard from ordinary clients. She keeps him distracted, one man said calmly. He will never suspect anything. The other answered, good. Once the confirmation arrives, everyone follows the original positions. Rachel remained perfectly still, afraid that even the sound of her breathing might reveal her presence. The first man checked his watch. The girlfriend knows exactly what to do. Rachel's eyebrows slowly lifted. Girlfriend? Her thoughts immediately returned to the elegant brunette seated beside Ethan. She tried to convince herself they were discussing someone else. Manhattan restaurants welcomed dozens of couples every night. It had to be a coincidence. She quietly counted to 5 before stepping back into the hallway after the men disappeared. Her heart was beating much faster than before. Returning to the kitchen, she accidentally added salt instead of sugar to a fresh pitcher of iced tea, forcing the bartender to laugh while pouring it down the sink. Your mind is somewhere else tonight, he joked. Rachel forced a smile that did not quite reach her eyes. Maybe I just need more sleep. Yet deep inside she knew that was not true. As she delivered dessert menus to table 7, she noticed Ethan listening politely while his companion spoke about an upcoming charity gala. He looked composed, thoughtful, almost gentle whenever someone addressed him. Nothing about the man resembled the frightening stories whispered throughout the city. Rachel looked at the woman beside him, then remembered the sentence she had overheard only moments earlier. She immediately felt guilty for even entertaining such an impossible suspicion. Judging strangers had never been part of who she was. Still, as she reached for the empty appetizer plates, her fingers brushed against the folded seating diagram hidden inside her apron. For the first time all evening, the scattered pieces refused to stay separate inside her mind. The marked tables, the mysterious envelope, the whispered instructions, the repeated mention of positions, and the unsettling reference to a girlfriend who supposedly knew the entire plan. Rachel suddenly realized she was no longer wondering whether she had overheard something important. She was desperately hoping she had misunderstood everything. Rachel carried an empty dessert tray toward the kitchen, but her feet seemed to move on their own while her thoughts remained trapped inside the tiny folded map hidden in her apron pocket. Every instinct told her to forget everything she had heard. She was a waitress, not a detective. People held private conversations in restaurants every day, and none of them belonged to her. If she misunderstood what she had overheard and accused innocent guests of something unimaginable, she would lose the best job she had ever found. The rent for her small apartment was already 3 weeks late. Her younger brother depended on the grocery money she sent every month while finishing community college in Ohio. She could not afford another mistake, especially one this enormous. Yet every time she looked toward table 7, the uneasy feeling returned. Ethan listened patiently while the elegant brunette smiled with effortless confidence, occasionally reaching across the table to straighten his tie or laugh at something he quietly said. Nothing about them suggested fear or conflict. They looked like two successful people enjoying another expensive evening together. Rachel almost convinced herself that she had invented the entire story inside her head until she passed near the secluded booth once again. It was empty now. Both mysterious men had disappeared, but one coffee cup remained untouched beside a neatly folded cloth napkin. Resting beneath the saucer was a small communication earpiece no larger than a coin. Rachel froze. Restaurant guests did not usually leave behind equipment like that. She quickly glanced around before picking it up, intending to bring it to the lost and found drawer. The tiny device suddenly emitted a faint crackling sound, followed by a calm voice. Final confirmation in 15 minutes. Rachel nearly dropped it onto the floor. Another voice answered immediately. Understood. Everyone remains in position until she distracts him. The transmission ended as suddenly as it had begun. Rachel stared at the silent earpiece resting in her trembling palm. Her heartbeat echoed louder than the jazz music drifting through the dining room. This was no misunderstanding anymore. She hurried into the employee hallway and leaned against the cool brick wall, desperately trying to think clearly. Should she tell Marco? He would probably assume she had misunderstood another conversation. Should she call the police? What exactly would she report? That she had found a strange map, overheard mysterious sentences, and discovered an earpiece with people speaking in coded language? Even she realized how unbelievable that sounded. What if everything really belonged to a private security company protecting an important client? She imagined police officers arriving, questioning everyone, discovering nothing, and Belladonna's never hiring her again. Rachel covered her face with both hands. Think, she whispered to herself. Please think. Then another memory surfaced. Earlier that afternoon, the restaurant manager had proudly announced that Ethan's security team preferred remaining invisible to avoid attracting attention inside the restaurant. If he already had professionals watching over him, why would anyone need secret instructions about distracting him? The answer settled quietly inside her heart before her mind accepted it. Someone close to him might not be protecting him at all. Rachel slowly lowered her hands and looked toward the dining room entrance where candlelight reflected across polished marble. She had spent her entire life avoiding conflict because she hated making people uncomfortable. Tonight's silence suddenly felt heavier than embarrassment. For the first time since beginning her job at Belladonna's, Rachel Brooks realized that saying nothing could become the biggest mistake she had ever made. Rachel hurried into the small service pantry and gently closed the door behind her, as if the thin wooden panel could somehow quiet the storm racing through her mind. The folded seating chart rested beside the tiny communication earpiece on a stainless steel counter while she stared at both items with growing disbelief. There has to be another explanation, she whispered, although the words sounded weaker each time she repeated them. She reached for a restaurant order pad, grabbed a pen, and immediately began writing what she had heard. Everyone is in position. She stopped halfway through the sentence, stared at the page, then quickly tore it off. It sounded ridiculous. Nobody would believe that. She crumpled the paper into a tiny ball and tossed it toward the trash can. It bounced off the rim and rolled back toward her shoes. Even my bad ideas do not want to leave, she sighed, forcing herself to smile despite the fear tightening inside her chest. She picked up another blank slip and tried again. Be careful. She frowned. Too vague. Ethan might ignore it completely. She tore the page away. A third attempt followed. Someone is planning something. She stared at the words before shaking her head once more. Planning what? If she could not explain it clearly, why would anyone else understand? The growing pile of crumpled paper beside the wastebasket looked almost comical, and for one strange moment Rachel wondered if future employees would believe someone had practiced basketball with receipt paper. Under different circumstances, she probably would have laughed. Instead, she pressed both hands against the cool countertop and took a slow breath. Her grandmother had always told her that courage was not about having the right words. It was about refusing to stay silent when silence felt wrong. Rachel closed her eyes for only a second before opening them with unexpected determination. She unfolded one final order slip and carefully printed each letter as neatly as she could. Your girlfriend sold you out. They are in position. She read the sentence 3 times. It sounded impossible, frightening, and unfair. Yet every piece she had accidentally discovered pointed toward the same conclusion. She folded the note into a tiny square and slipped it into her apron pocket. The next problem appeared immediately. How could she deliver it without attracting attention? Walking directly to Ethan and whispering in his ear would cause every eye in the restaurant to turn toward them. Asking him to step outside would almost certainly bring security to her before she finished the sentence. Even placing the note openly on the table might allow someone else to read it first. She quietly paced across the narrow room, accidentally walking into a mop bucket that rolled across the floor with a loud squeak. Rachel froze in horror before realizing nobody had entered. Focus, she whispered to herself. Please just focus. Then inspiration arrived from the simplest place imaginable. Every entree at Belladonna's was served with a folded quality inspection card tucked beneath the dinner plate. Customers rarely noticed it until after the meal. If she carefully slid the folded warning beneath Ethan's plate while clearing dessert dishes, only he would likely discover it. It was far from perfect, but it was the only chance she had. She straightened her apron, brushed invisible wrinkles from her uniform, and reached for the dessert tray waiting outside the pantry. Her hands still trembled, but the hesitation that had followed her all evening was gone. Rachel Brooks was still the same clumsy waitress who apologized too often and laughed at her own mistakes. The difference was that now she had chosen which mistakes she could live with, and remaining silent was no longer one of them. Rachel balanced the dessert tray with deliberate care as she stepped back into the warm glow of the dining room. Every movement suddenly felt louder than the music, every heartbeat stronger than the quiet conversations surrounding her. She reminded herself to breathe normally, smile naturally, and avoid attracting attention. The folded note rested beneath the edge of the small inspection card exactly as she had planned. It looked ordinary enough that no one would notice unless they searched for it. At least that was what she hoped. As she approached table 7, Ethan was listening while his companion described plans for a weekend charity auction. Her voice remained polished and confident, yet Rachel noticed something she had overlooked before. Whenever Ethan briefly glanced toward the restaurant entrance, the woman smoothly redirected his attention back to the conversation with another question or another smile. It was subtle, almost graceful, but after everything Rachel had heard, the pattern no longer felt accidental. She placed a slice of tiramisu before each guest, thanked them politely, and began collecting the empty dinner plates. Her fingers trembled only slightly as she lifted Ethan's plate. In one smooth motion, she tucked the folded note beneath the fresh dessert plate before setting it back onto the table. The movement lasted less than 2 seconds. Nobody appeared to notice. Rachel quietly stepped away, resisting every instinct to look back. Instead, she retreated to the service station, pretending to polish silverware while secretly watching the table through the reflection in a polished coffee urn. Several endless seconds passed. Ethan reached for his fork, then paused when he noticed the tiny folded paper beneath the edge of the plate. His expression did not change. Without drawing attention, he slipped the note into his lap and continued listening to the conversation as though nothing unusual had happened. Rachel felt a brief wave of relief until another thought struck her. What if he believed the message came from someone trying to manipulate him? What if he simply threw it away without reading another word? Across the room, Ethan unfolded the paper beneath the tablecloth, hidden from every guest except himself. His gray eyes moved across the handwritten sentence once. Then he read it again. The room around him continued exactly as before. Crystal glasses reflected candlelight. Soft jazz floated through the air. Waiters crossed the dining room, carrying steaming plates. Yet inside Ethan's mind, something quietly shifted. During years of leading complicated business negotiations, he had learned that lies usually arrived wrapped in confidence. Truth, however, often appeared clumsy, incomplete, and unexpected. He slowly lifted his eyes and searched the restaurant without moving his head. Rachel immediately looked away, pretending to arrange dessert spoons that already sat perfectly straight. Ethan noticed everything. The young waitress was nervous enough to stack identical spoons 3 separate times. She nearly placed a coffee cup onto an empty tray instead of the serving cart before catching herself at the last second. Nothing about her suggested someone capable of inventing an elaborate deception. She looked frightened, apologetic, and completely out of place inside a dangerous secret she clearly wished had never found her. Ethan folded the note into a tiny square and slipped it inside his jacket pocket. His companion continued speaking with effortless elegance, unaware that his attention had quietly moved elsewhere. For the first time that evening, he chose not to answer her immediately. Instead, he calmly reached for his water glass and allowed his eyes to drift once more toward the shy waitress standing near the service station. Rachel accidentally dropped a polished dessert spoon onto the floor at that exact moment. The tiny clink echoed across the marble. She quickly picked it up, cheeks burning with embarrassment, never realizing that her familiar clumsiness had become the very reason Ethan found the anonymous warning unexpectedly difficult to dismiss. The folded note remained in Ethan's jacket pocket, but its weight seemed far greater than a single piece of paper. He continued the dinner exactly as before, responding politely whenever someone spoke to him, yet his mind quietly measured every detail surrounding the table. Years of making difficult decisions had taught him that panic invited mistakes, while patience often revealed truths that hurried people overlooked. Without appearing suspicious, he lifted his wrist as though checking the time. The reflection in his watch crystal gave him a wider view of the dining room than anyone realized. He noticed two unfamiliar men standing near opposite exits, each pretending to study framed artwork instead of the guests. He noticed another individual seated alone by the window who had not touched a single bite of dessert. Most importantly, he noticed Rachel. She was trying very hard not to look toward him, which only made it obvious that she desperately wanted to know whether he had read the message. Ethan found himself asking an unexpected question. Why would someone like her invent such a dangerous lie? She had nothing to gain. She looked more frightened than anyone else in the room. Across the table, his companion smiled warmly before reaching for his hand. "You seem distracted," she said softly. Ethan returned a calm smile. "Long week." The answer sounded effortless, but instead of squeezing her hand as he normally might, he gently reached for his coffee cup instead. The smallest hesitation passed almost unnoticed, except by Rachel, who happened to glance across the room while carrying fresh espresso. She saw Ethan quietly shift his chair several inches, changing his position at the table under the simple excuse of making room for the server. To everyone else it appeared completely ordinary. Rachel frowned. Had he believed her? Or was she imagining things again? Before she could decide, the restaurant lights flickered for less than a second. Nobody seemed concerned. Belladonna's occupied a historic building where electrical systems occasionally blinked during heavy evening demand. Conversations continued. Silverware clinked gently against porcelain. The jazz trio never stopped playing. Yet Ethan quietly placed his napkin on the table. "Would anyone mind if we moved to the lounge for coffee?" he asked with relaxed confidence. His guest looked mildly surprised. His companion tilted her head. "Why? We are comfortable here." Ethan smiled. "I would like to see the fireplace before we leave. I have heard they recently restored it." It sounded like a harmless suggestion. After a brief pause, everyone agreed. Chairs slid back. The group calmly stood and began walking toward the elegant lounge on the opposite side of the restaurant. Rachel watched them with cautious hope. Less than 5 seconds after they left table 7, a large decorative chandelier hanging above the original seating area suddenly released several crystal ornaments that scattered harmlessly across the now empty table and carpet below with a loud crash that startled everyone inside the restaurant. Guests gasped and quickly stepped back, while employees rushed forward to secure the area. Nobody was injured. The restaurant manager repeatedly apologized, insisting the maintenance company had inspected every fixture only weeks earlier. Ethan quietly looked at the vacant seats where he had been sitting moments before. The timing felt impossible to ignore. His companion appeared genuinely startled, but something else caught his attention. Instead of asking whether he was all right, her eyes instinctively searched the room, almost as if she expected something that had failed to happen. Ethan said nothing. Rachel stood frozen near the dessert station with one hand covering her mouth. The chandelier accident could have been an unbelievable coincidence. Perhaps it truly was nothing more than old hardware finally giving way. Yet when Ethan slowly turned toward her from across the room, their eyes met for only a brief moment. Neither of them spoke a single word, But for the first time that evening, they shared the same silent realization. The warning had changed at least one decision, and that decision had changed everything that followed. The restaurant staff immediately surrounded the damaged dining area, guiding startled guests a safe distance away while managers apologized with practiced professionalism. Rachel instinctively grabbed a broom from the service closet before remembering she had never been assigned to help with cleanup around broken crystal. She awkwardly stopped in the middle of the hallway, realized she was carrying the broom upside down, quietly flipped it around, and almost bumped into Marco. He stared at her for a second before gently taking it from her hands. "Maybe let maintenance handle this one," he said with a tired smile. Rachel gave an embarrassed nod. "That is probably a very good idea." Even in the middle of confusion, her innocent honesty earned the smallest laugh from him. Across the room, Ethan stood near the lounge entrance, calmly observing the activity without contributing to the growing panic. His expression remained composed, but inside his thoughts were moving faster than anyone could imagine. The warning note had not predicted exactly what would happen. It had simply urged him to be cautious because someone close to him had betrayed him. The unexpected accident above table 7 could still be dismissed as coincidence. Yet coincidence rarely arrived hand in hand with anonymous messages, mysterious conversations, and strangers quietly monitoring restaurant exits. His companion approached with visible concern. "We should probably leave," she suggested. Ethan looked toward the damaged dining area before answering. "In a few minutes." She studied him carefully. "You never stay anywhere after unexpected situations." Ethan smiled politely. "Perhaps I am trying something different tonight." The answer sounded casual, but it left her strangely unsettled. Rachel, meanwhile, returned to collecting empty coffee cups in the lounge, trying to behave as though nothing unusual had happened. Her hand still shook slightly each time she reached for a saucer. As she approached Ethan's table, one of the porcelain cups slipped from her fingers. She gasped, lunged forward in pure panic, and somehow caught it against the front of her apron before it reached the carpet. A few drops of coffee splashed onto her sleeve, but the cup remained intact. Rachel looked at it with complete disbelief. "I think that is the first thing I have saved all night," she whispered to herself. Ethan heard every word. For reasons he could not explain, the awkward little moment made him trust her even more. People skilled at deception rarely laughed at themselves with such genuine embarrassment. Before Rachel stepped away, Ethan quietly spoke for the first time since reading the note. "Mississippi." She turned immediately. "Yes, sir." His calm gray eyes met hers without intimidation. "Would you bring me another glass of sparkling water?" "Of course." Nothing about the request sounded unusual, yet as she nodded, Ethan gently placed the folded dessert menu closer to the edge of the table with one finger. Beneath it rested the tiny handwritten warning she had given him earlier. He had unfolded it once more. On the blank reverse side, he had written only 4 words. "Did you see who?" Rachel's heartbeat nearly stopped. She carried the empty coffee cups toward the service station, pretending not to notice the message while desperately searching her memory. She had overheard voices. She had found the map. She had seen suspicious behavior. But she had never actually witnessed anyone giving direct instructions except those mysterious men. And then another memory quietly returned. The elegant brunette had excused herself twice during dinner, each time for only a minute or two, and each time one of the unfamiliar men had disappeared from the dining room at almost the exact same moment. Rachel stood perfectly still behind the service counter as the pieces slowly aligned. Until that instant, she had feared she might be imagining connections that did not exist. Now, for the first time, she realized. Ethan was no longer asking whether the warning was true. He was asking her to help him understand how far the truth actually reached. Rachel picked up a clean glass, filled it with sparkling water, and stood motionless for several seconds before gathering enough courage to return to the lounge. Her heart insisted she should stay quiet. Her conscience refused to let her. She placed the glass gently beside Ethan and, pretending to adjust the folded dessert menu, carefully wrote 4 short words beneath his question using the restaurant pen she always carried. 2 men. She left before anyone noticed. Ethan lowered his eyes only after she disappeared toward the service station. 2 men. That confirmed what his instincts had already begun assembling. Without changing his expression, he folded the menu closed and thanked his companion for suggesting dessert, continuing the conversation with remarkable composure. Yet behind that calm exterior, years of experience quietly took over. He casually reached for his phone, unlocked the screen beneath the table, and sent a single text message containing only 3 words to someone whose number he knew by memory. Check everything quietly. Less than 30 seconds later, his phone vibrated once. Message received. Nothing else. No questions. No explanations. Across the restaurant, 2 sharply dressed men entered through the front entrance as ordinary customers. They ordered coffee, exchanged friendly greetings with the hostess, and selected separate tables without acknowledging one another. To everyone else, they appeared completely unrelated. Ethan never looked directly toward them, but he noticed both reflections in the polished windows. Rachel, meanwhile, tried to continue working as though her entire world had not turned upside down. She accidentally handed the dessert wine list to a family ordering hot chocolate, immediately apologized, and exchanged it with such sincere embarrassment that the parents smiled kindly instead of complaining. Even under enormous pressure, her gentle nature refused to disappear. Marco quietly touched her shoulder. You have had a rough night. Rachel forced a small smile. I think my brain forgot how restaurants work. Go drink some water, he said. 5 minutes. Grateful for the brief break, Rachel stepped into the empty hallway leading toward the employee lockers. Before she reached the corner, she heard familiar voices again. She immediately stopped. The chandelier failed. One man whispered with unmistakable frustration. He changed seats. Another voice answered calmly. Then somebody warned him. Rachel's stomach tightened. Find the leak before he leaves. Silence followed. Rachel waited until the footsteps faded before slowly exhaling. There was no doubt anymore. The warning had mattered. Someone truly had expected Ethan to remain beneath that chandelier. She hurried back toward the dining room, but in her nervous rush, she rounded the corner too quickly and walked straight into Ethan himself. He had quietly stepped away from the lounge without attracting attention. Rachel gasped. I am so sorry. She instinctively reached to steady herself, then immediately pulled her hands back, embarrassed once again. Ethan gently shook his head. You do not need to apologize every 30 seconds. The unexpected kindness caught her completely off guard. She looked down at the floor, unable to meet his eyes. It is a bad habit. Ethan's voice remained calm enough that anyone nearby would assume they were discussing ordinary restaurant service. Did you hear anything else? Rachel hesitated only a moment before answering softly. They know someone warned you. Ethan absorbed the sentence without visible reaction. He simply nodded once. Thank you. No dramatic speech followed. No promises. No panic. Just 2 simple words spoken with complete sincerity. Rachel watched him return toward the lounge, still carrying himself with the same quiet confidence as before. Yet something had changed between them. A few hours earlier, they had been complete strangers separated by wealth, power, and circumstance. Now they shared a dangerous secret built entirely upon the courage of one ordinary waitress who had chosen honesty over comfort, and one powerful man who had decided to trust the most unlikely person in the room. Within 15 minutes, the atmosphere inside Belladonna's began returning to what most guests believed was normal. The damaged dining area had been discreetly closed behind elegant velvet ropes, while servers redirected customers with polished smiles and complimentary desserts. Soft piano music replaced the jazz trio, and conversations slowly grew louder again. To everyone else, the evening's interruption had become nothing more than an unfortunate maintenance problem. Rachel wished she could believe the same thing. She refilled coffee cups almost automatically, but her thoughts remained fixed on the quiet conversation in the hallway and Ethan's simple words of gratitude. Nobody had ever thanked her for speaking up about something that truly mattered. Most people thanked her for extra napkins or fast service. This felt completely different. As she collected empty dessert plates from another table, Marco approached carrying the evening schedule. Good news, he said with relief. The VIP party is wrapping up early, so you can clock out after we finish closing the lounge. Rachel smiled for the first time in what felt like hours. That is wonderful. Then she accidentally placed a stack of clean plates onto the cart, already holding dirty dishes. Marco laughed softly before switching them back. There she is, he joked. I was beginning to worry you had become coordinated. Rachel laughed too, grateful that someone could still make ordinary jokes on such an extraordinary night. Across the lounge, Ethan's phone vibrated once more. He glanced at the message without changing expression. We confirmed multiple inconsistencies. Leave through the north entrance. He quietly slipped the phone into his pocket before turning toward the elegant brunette beside him. I need to visit one more meeting tonight, he said pleasantly. My driver will take you home first. She blinked in surprise. We were supposed to leave together. Ethan smiled with the same calm courtesy he had shown throughout dinner. Another evening. For the first time since they had arrived, disappointment crossed her face before disappearing behind a practiced smile. She agreed without argument, but Ethan noticed her fingers tighten ever so slightly around her handbag before she stood. It was another tiny detail, joining a growing list of questions that demanded answers. Several minutes later, the guests began leaving one by one. Rachel stood near the entrance, thanking everyone for visiting. Her voice warmed despite her exhaustion. Ethan approached last. Their eyes met briefly. No one around them would have guessed they had exchanged handwritten warnings and silent conversations throughout the evening. He paused just long enough to place the restaurant comment card into the small collection box beside the hostess stand. Excellent service, he said politely, especially from the young waitress. Rachel immediately looked behind herself, convinced he must be speaking about someone else. When she realized he meant her, she instinctively pointed toward her own chest. Me? Ethan nodded once. Yes, you. Rachel's cheeks turned bright red. Thank you, sir. After he stepped outside, curiosity quietly defeated her. During a brief lull, she opened the comment box to organize the cards before closing time. Among the folded surveys, she found one sealed envelope addressed only with her first name. Inside rested a handwritten note in careful block letters. You trusted your conscience when fear would have been easier. Do not lose that part of yourself. There was no signature. Rachel read the sentence twice before gently folding it again. She slipped it into her apron pocket beside the tiny order pad that had carried her own warning only an hour earlier. Standing beneath the warm lights of the restaurant entrance, she realized she still had no idea who Ethan Knight truly was beyond the rumors surrounding his name. Yet she knew one thing with complete certainty. Beneath the tailored suits, quiet confidence, and intimidating reputation was a man who recognized courage even when it arrived disguised as an awkward smile, trembling hands, and a waitress who could barely carry a tray without turning an ordinary evening into something unforgettable. 1 week later, Belladonna's looked exactly as it always had. Candlelight shimmered across polished marble, soft music floated through the dining room, and Rachel Brooks was once again trying very hard to convince gravity to cooperate with her. She carried a tray filled with sparkling water toward a family celebrating a birthday when the corner of her apron caught another chair. Not again, she whispered to herself just before the tray tilted. Several glasses leaned dangerously toward the edge. Rachel squeezed her eyes shut, preparing for the familiar sound of breaking glass. Instead, another steady hand gently caught the tray before anything could fall. She opened her eyes in surprise. Ethan Knight stood beside her wearing a charcoal overcoat instead of the tailored suit from the previous week, his calm expression unchanged except for the faintest smile. Easy, he said quietly. Rachel blinked twice before laughing in embarrassed disbelief. I was winning for almost 3 whole hours. Ethan carefully helped steady the tray before stepping back. That might be a new record. She laughed so hard that a nearby customer smiled without even knowing why. Thank you, she said, still holding the tray with both hands. I think the restaurant should start charging customers extra whenever I carry drinks. Then they would miss the best part of dinner, Ethan replied. Rachel tilted her head in confusion. What is that? Watching someone who refuses to stop smiling after every mistake. She looked down at the floor, her cheeks warming once again. Nobody had ever described her that way. After delivering the drinks without spilling a single drop, she returned to find Ethan waiting near the hostess stand. This time he was alone. May I ask you something? He said. Rachel nodded immediately. Of course. Why did you help me? She thought about the question far longer than he expected. Finally, she shrugged with complete honesty. Because I could not go home wondering if staying quiet had hurt someone. I was scared the whole time. I almost convinced myself to do nothing. But my grandmother always said that fear is temporary. Regret stays much longer. Ethan remained silent for a moment, absorbing every word. During his life, he had met powerful executives, respected attorneys, politicians, and people who proudly spoke about honor. Yet the simplest definition of courage had come from an ordinary waitress who apologized too much and believed sharing half of her blueberry muffin could make someone else's day better. "You changed more than one evening," he said softly. "You reminded me that trust should be earned, not assumed." Rachel smiled awkwardly. "I mostly reminded everyone that I still trip over furniture." Ethan actually laughed, a genuine laugh that surprised even himself. Several employees exchanged curious glances because none of them had ever seen the famously reserved businessman laugh inside the restaurant. Before leaving, Ethan handed Marco a sealed envelope. "For your employee of the week," he said politely. After he walked outside, Marco opened it and stared in disbelief. Inside was a generous contribution to the restaurant's Employee Appreciation Fund along with one handwritten request. "Please make sure Rachel Brooks always has a place here as long as she wants one." Rachel's eyes immediately filled with tears. "I do not even know what to say." Marco folded the letter carefully before placing it into her hands. "Maybe just keep being yourself." Rachel looked through the front window as Ethan's car disappeared into the evening traffic. She slipped the letter beside the first note he had left her, knowing she would keep both for the rest of her life. She was still the same cheerful young woman who bumped into chairs, laughed at her own clumsiness, and believed kindness cost nothing. He was still a man carrying responsibilities most people could never imagine. Their worlds remained different, yet one quiet decision had built a bridge between them that neither wealth nor status could measure. And on that ordinary Manhattan evening, everyone who truly witnessed what happened learned that dignity is often protected not by the loudest voice in the room, but by the gentlest heart willing to speak when it matters most.